Yesterday, your plant looked healthy. Today, the leaves are yellow. The stems are drooping. The flowers have disappeared. And your first thought is always the same. I killed another one. Except, that's probably not what happened. Most plants don't die because people forget to water them. They die because gardeners keep fixing symptoms instead of the real problem hiding underground, where you can't see it, and where the actual damage is always happening first. Today I'll show you the 5 mistakes almost every gardener unknowingly makes, and once you understand them, you'll stop replacing dead plants year after year. Here's why this matters right now. Summers have been intense and unpredictable across a lot of the country. Rainfall's been inconsistent. More people than ever are gardening in containers instead of open ground, and plant prices at the nursery keep climbing every season. Replacing a dead plant isn't just disappointing anymore, it's a real expense. If you're a beginner who's been told gardening is easy, and then watched plant after plant struggle anyway, none of that was bad luck. It was almost always one of 5 specific, fixable problems. And here's something worth saying clearly before we get into any of this. If you've spent hundreds of dollars over the years replacing plants that just wouldn't survive, that's not a reflection of your ability as a gardener. Garden centers rarely explain any of what we're about to cover, because a tag that says water weekly, full sun, fits on a plastic stick, while the actual biology of what keeps a plant alive genuinely doesn't. You were set up to guess. This video is about giving you the actual information instead. By the end of this video, you'll know exactly why plants actually die, what healthy roots genuinely need, how to diagnose a struggling plant correctly instead of guessing, how to save one that's already in trouble, and how to stop this exact cycle from repeating next season. How many plants have you accidentally lost? Let me know in the comments. Honestly, no judgment here. I've lost my fair share too, and that's really where this whole video comes from. Let's get into secret number 1. Secret number 1. Watering on a schedule instead of watering the plant. Imagine you just brought home a beautiful peace lily. You commit to watering it every single day, because that feels responsible. That feels like good care. 2 weeks later, the leaves are drooping and turning yellow at the edges, so you water it more. It gets worse. By week 3, you're convinced you simply don't have whatever instinct other people seem to have for this, and you're one bad week away from giving up on houseplants entirely. Here's why almost every gardener unknowingly makes this exact mistake. Watering on a fixed schedule feels like discipline, like something you can control and get right. But plants don't actually care what day it is. They care about the actual moisture sitting in the soil around their roots, and that changes constantly based on heat, humidity, pot size, and how much the plant is actively growing that week. Here's the science, in plain terms. Roots don't just absorb water, they also need to breathe. The spaces between soil particles hold both water and air, and roots pull oxygen out of that air to fuel the energy processes that keep the whole plant alive. When soil stays constantly saturated, water fills every one of those air pockets, and the roots essentially start suffocating. This is exactly why overwatering kills far more houseplants than underwatering ever does, even though the symptoms, drooping, yellowing, look almost identical to a thirsty plant, which is exactly why so many people respond by watering even more. Here's what's actually happening underground when this goes wrong. Suffocated roots stop functioning properly, and damaged, oxygen-starved roots become an open door for the fungal pathogens that cause root rot. Once rot sets in, those roots physically can't pull up water anymore, even though they're sitting in plenty of it. The plant wilts from a lack of water while drowning in it at the same time, which is the exact paradox that confuses almost everyone the first time they see it. Here's the practical fix. Stop watering by calendar entirely. Instead, check the actual soil. Stick a finger, or a wooden chopstick, about 2 inches into the soil. If it comes out clean and dry, water thoroughly until it runs from the drainage hole. If it comes out with soil clinging to it, wait. This single habit change prevents more plant deaths than any product you could buy. It's worth mentioning that different plants genuinely want different moisture levels, and that's part of why a single blanket watering schedule fails so consistently. A succulent wants its soil to dry out almost completely between waterings, while a peace lily wants consistent, though never soggy, moisture. The finger test works for both. It just means the answer you're checking for is different depending on what you're growing, which is exactly why learning to read the actual soil matters more than memorizing a generic rule. Here's what to expect. Within a week, a plant caught early in this cycle usually perks back up noticeably once watering actually matches its real needs. Within a month, root development should visibly improve if you repot into fresh, well-draining soil. Across a full growing season, plants cared for this way develop stronger, more extensive root systems that make them dramatically more resilient to the next heat wave or missed watering. And here's a myth worth killing right now. Watering every single day is not more caring. It's usually the single fastest way to kill a plant that would have otherwise been perfectly fine. But the next mistake is actually killing more plants than this one, and it's hiding in the one place almost nobody thinks to check. Secret number 2, the drainage problem. Hiding in decorative pots. Picture this. You buy a gorgeous ceramic pot, the kind with no hole in the bottom, because it looks so much better on your shelf than plastic. You water carefully, you're genuinely being responsible about it, checking the soil, not overdoing it. And the plant still dies within a couple of months, and you have no idea why, because as far as you can tell, you did everything right this time. Almost every gardener makes this mistake at least once, because decorative pots are sold constantly without drainage holes, and nothing about the packaging warns you that this is a problem. Here's the science. Without a drainage hole, every bit of water you pour in has nowhere to go. It pools at the bottom of the pot, right where the roots are sitting, and just stays there, sometimes for weeks. Here's exactly what happens underground. That standing water creates the same oxygen-starved, waterlogged environment we just talked about in Secret 1, except this time there's no amount of correct watering habits that can fix it, because the water genuinely cannot escape. Roots sitting in stagnant water are also sitting in the perfect breeding ground for the exact fungal pathogens that cause root rot, and because you can't see the bottom of the pot, this often goes completely unnoticed until the plant is already collapsing. Here's the fix. If a pot doesn't have a drainage hole, either drill one, if the material allows it, or use it purely as a decorative outer sleeve and keep the plant in its original plastic nursery pot inside, lifting it out to water separately and letting it fully drain before placing it back. Never let a pot sit in standing water in a saucer either. That's the exact same problem in a different container. This is also worth checking on pots you already own and assume are fine. Some ceramic and resin pots are sold with a small drainage hole that's actually too narrow to drain effectively once soil compacts around it over time, so it looks like it should work while functioning almost like a sealed pot anyway. If water still isn't draining freely a minute or two after watering, that's worth investigating regardless of whether a hole is technically present. Here's your timeline. Within a week of fixing drainage, a plant that was struggling but not yet badly rotted usually shows visible improvement. Within a month, you should see genuine new growth resuming. Across a season, correctly draining containers are simply less work, since you stop second-guessing every watering out of fear of what's happening at the bottom where you can't see. Here's a myth to retire. Adding a layer of rocks at the bottom of a pot without drainage does not actually create effective drainage, it just moves where the standing water sits and gives you a false sense of security while the roots above it are still in trouble. Most gardeners never realize this until the plant is already too far gone, and the next secret explains exactly why the warning signs are so easy to misread in the first place. Secret number 3, misreading what your plant is actually telling you. Here's a story almost every gardener has lived through. Your plant's leaves start turning yellow and drooping. Your gut instinct says it needs water, so you water it. And it gets worse, not better, and now you're genuinely confused because you responded to what looked like an obvious signal. This is where almost everyone gets it wrong, because overwatering and underwatering produce nearly identical visible symptoms: drooping, yellowing, leaves that feel soft. Visually, from across the room, they can look exactly the same, even though the actual problem and the actual fix are complete opposites. Here's the science behind why that happens. A dehydrated plant wilts because its cells physically run out of the water pressure, called turgor pressure, that keeps leaves and stems firm and upright. An overwatered plant wilts because its damaged, rotting roots can no longer pull up water at all, even though the soil is soaked. Same visible symptom, two opposite underlying causes. Here's why guessing wrong is so damaging. If you respond to overwatering symptoms by watering more, you accelerate root rot and often kill the plant within days. If you respond to underwatering symptoms by withholding water out of caution, a genuinely thirsty plant can decline just as fast. Getting the diagnosis backward doesn't just fail to help, it actively speeds up the exact outcome you're trying to prevent. Here's the practical solution, and it's simple. Before you do anything else, always check the soil directly. The same 2-inch finger or chopstick test from Secret 1. Soil that's dry several inches down with drooping leaves means the plant is thirsty, water it. Soil that's still wet with drooping, yellowing leaves means the plant is overwatered, stop watering, and check that drainage is actually working the way Secret 2 describes. There's one more clue worth checking alongside the soil test, since it can confirm your diagnosis. Gently touch a drooping leaf. A thirsty, dehydrated leaf typically still feels somewhat firm, just limp from lack of pressure. An overwatered, rotting leaf often feels soft, almost mushy, sometimes even slightly yellow or translucent at the edges, before it fully browns. That texture difference, combined with the soil check, makes misdiagnosis far less likely going forward. Most people watching have probably made at least 3 of these mistakes already, and honestly, so have plenty of experienced gardeners. But the next secret is the one that completely changed how I think about caring for plants at all. Here's your realistic timeline once you're diagnosing correctly instead of guessing. Within a week, correctly identifying and responding to the actual problem should stop further decline. Within a month, new growth should confirm you diagnosed it right. Across a season, this single skill, checking before reacting, prevents the majority of the panic-driven mistakes that kill otherwise healthy plants. And here's the myth this secret quietly destroys. Drooping leaves do not always mean thirsty. That assumption alone has probably killed more plants than any pest or disease ever has. Secret number 4. More fertilizer is not more food. Here's a situation a lot of gardeners recognize instantly. Your plant looks a little weak, a little pale, not thriving the way you'd hoped. So you decide a boost couldn't hurt. You fertilize generously, maybe more than the label says, because more surely helps more. The same logic you'd apply to almost anything else. Within days, leaf edges start turning brown and crispy, and the plant looks noticeably worse than before you touched it, which feels backward and confusing. This mistake happens because fertilizer is marketed almost like plant food in the same sense human food works. More nutrition, more growth, more health. That's not actually how it functions at the root level. Here's the science, kept simple. Fertilizer is essentially a concentrated mix of mineral salts. Plant roots absorb water through a natural process where water moves from an area of lower salt concentration, outside the root, to higher concentration, inside the root. Over-fertilizing floods the soil with so many mineral salts that this process actually reverses, pulling water out of the roots instead of into them. Here's what's actually happening underground when that occurs. It's called fertilizer burn, and it's essentially a chemical dehydration happening at the root level, even in soil that's perfectly moist. The plant is technically sitting in adequate water, but it can no longer absorb it, which produces symptoms, crispy brown leaf edges, sudden wilting, that genuinely confuse people who assume they've been generous and helpful. Here's the fix. Always dilute fertilizer to at or below the label's recommended strength, never above it, and only feed during active growth, typically spring through summer for most plants. Not during dormant periods in fall and winter, when the plant isn't using nutrients anyway. If you've already over-fertilized, flush the soil thoroughly with plain water, several times the pot's volume, to physically wash out the excess salts. When you're flushing, pour slowly and let the water fully drain between pours, rather than dumping it all at once, which gives the water time to actually carry dissolved salts out through the drainage holes, instead of just running past them. For a plant that's been over-fertilized repeatedly over time, you may need to repeat this flush 2 or 3 times over the following weeks, since salts that have built up in the soil over months don't always clear in a single pass. Here's your expected timeline. Within a week of flushing over-fertilized soil, further decline should stop. Within a month, new, undamaged growth should start replacing the burned leaves. Across a season, feeding at the correct dilution, only during active growth, produces steadier, healthier development than any aggressive feeding schedule ever does. Here's the myth worth correcting here. A struggling plant almost never needs more fertilizer as a first response. In most cases, the struggle has nothing to do with nutrition at all, and feeding a plant that's actually dealing with a watering or drainage problem just adds fertilizer burn on top of an existing issue. This next secret is the one that ties every single thing we've covered together, and it's the one that finally explains why a plant can be watered, drained, diagnosed, and fed correctly, and still eventually struggle anyway. Secret number 5. The roots ran out of room. Here's a scenario a lot of longtime plant owners eventually run into. A plant that thrived for 2 full years suddenly starts declining, even though nothing about your care routine has changed at all. You're watering correctly, the drainage is fine, you're feeding it properly. And it's still struggling. Almost nobody suspects this cause, because it doesn't feel like something you did wrong. It feels like the plant just stopped cooperating for no reason. Here's the science. As a plant grows, its root system grows right along with it, and inside a container, that growth is physically limited by the pot's walls. Eventually, roots run out of room to expand outward, and they start circling the inside of the pot instead, wrapping around themselves in an increasingly dense, tangled mass. Here's what that actually does underground. A root-bound plant has roots so densely packed that water runs straight through the pot without ever really being absorbed, since there's barely any actual soil left between the roots to hold it. At the same time, the plant has completely exhausted the available nutrients in that soil, and the tangled roots physically can't expand to reach new resources. The plant is essentially starving and dehydrated at the same time, inside a pot that looks, from the outside, completely normal. Here's how to actually check. Gently slide the plant out of its pot. If you see roots densely circling the inside wall, forming a tight, root-shaped mass with barely any visible soil, that's your answer. Here's the fix. Repot into a container roughly 2 inches larger in diameter than the current one, not dramatically larger, which can actually cause its own problems with excess soil holding too much water around a small root system. Gently loosen and tease apart the outer circling roots before repotting, which encourages them to grow outward into the new soil instead of continuing to circle. Use fresh potting mix, since the old soil is depleted regardless of how healthy it once was. As a general rule of thumb worth remembering, most actively growing houseplants benefit from a root check every 12 to 18 months, even if nothing looks wrong on the surface yet. Catching a root-bound plant early, before it's showing real distress, means a much simpler recovery than waiting until the leaves are already yellowing and dropping, since a plant that's severely root-bound for a long stretch takes noticeably longer to bounce back, even after repotting correctly. Here's your timeline. Within a week of repotting, most plants show renewed vigor as roots finally have room to expand again. Within a month, noticeable new growth typically appears. Across a season, a plant given room to grow when it actually needs it will consistently outperform one left root-bound indefinitely. And importantly, this is also completely preventable by checking root growth every year or two, long before a plant shows visible distress. And here's the final myth this video is really built around. A bigger pot is not automatically better, and jumping to an oversized container prematurely creates the exact same waterlogging problems we covered back in Secret 1, just with more room for the water to hide in. So here's what we've actually covered today. Watering by the plant's real needs, not a calendar. Making sure drainage genuinely works, not just looks like it does. Diagnosing symptoms correctly before reacting, since drooping can mean 2 completely opposite problems. Feeding correctly, and only when the plant is actually growing. And giving roots room before they run out of it entirely. Notice that not one of these 5 secrets involved buying a single new product. That's not an accident. Almost everything that actually kills houseplants and garden plants comes down to a handful of decisions you're already making anyway. Watering, containers, feeding, timing, just made with a slightly better understanding of what's actually happening underneath the soil. Successful gardening was never luck. It's understanding how plants actually grow and responding to what they're genuinely dealing with instead of what seems like the obvious guess. Which of these 5 secrets surprised you the most? Let me know in the comments, and if you're watching from a hot climate, drop your USDA zone below too. I'm curious how much of this lines up across different regions. If you found this valuable, you need to watch my next video, where I break down the easiest plants that practically grow themselves, even if you've struggled with gardening for years. Go ahead and like this video, subscribe if you want more of this kind of practical plant care, and comment which secret is going to change something in your own routine this week. Healthy gardens don't come from buying more products. They come from understanding what your plants have been trying to tell you all along.